APIs give you a good way to start using capabilities, but oftentimes it's more than just one thing that you have to do. You have to do a sequence of steps. You could call that a process or workflows. And in many cases, this is really where the value of API lies. So far, we don't have that many specifications or this much help in how this can be done. And with us today is Frank Kilcommons of SmartBear. Hey, Frank, how are you doing?
I'm good, Eric. Happy to be here.
Thanks for joining. So, what we'll talk about today is workflows. So, there's a workflows specification that is being worked on in the Open API initiative. And this is something that you're working on. You're part of that working group. And today we just want to dive a little bit into what workflows are doing. So, give us your brief pitch, so to speak, what the workflow specification looks like, please.
Sure. Well, the workflow specification describes an approach to document use case orientated workflows in a programmatical, readable format. So we all love YAML, of course. So it's kind of that sweet spot where it's sufficiently human readable, but it's also very easy for the machines to parse and to understand. And when we talk about a workflow in this context, it's a series of API calls which together accomplish some business objective. And they could be a series of calls that are described in a single API document, like an open API document, or it could span and bridge multiple documents as well. And currently, there is no way to kind of meaningfully describe that. The additional human readable nature, of course, really elevates the ability for us to kind of tell that story of what an API and what value an API can bring to the consumer, and in a way that allows tooling vendors to kind of really elevate that developer experience, as we would call it. Kind of the use cases that we're targeting with the specification is predominantly to provide a deterministic recipe for how to use APIs to achieve a particular outcome. And as I said, bridging that gap where you may need to span multiple API definitions in order to be able to achieve that. We see that as kind of reducing the problem that's out there with out-of-band documentation. So we always know that, yes, people provide a reference to the async API document or the open API document, but more often than not, that's accompanied with sequence diagrams, and they will be in kind of like a PDF form or some kind of other more, let's say, more human-centric form. And as soon as they're authored, they potentially are stale and out of sync. And we really want to have the concept of assertable living documentation that can be used to really determine, are these flows still possible through the APIs? We also see some very interesting capabilities around code gen for APIs, where you can focus on, I want to generate a client or generate the initial kind of boilerplate server to implement this specific business use case. And maybe the APIs that are there have lots of other endpoints, lots of other capabilities that are available, but you don't get distracted by all of that boilerplate code. So it very much kind of reduces the scope and the context that you're focused on, and really guides the consumer or the developer down the path to achieve that outcome as easy as possible. There's also sufficient interest across different regulatory fields. So especially within financial services and open banking, we see the workflows specification as a way to allow regulatory checks to happen against different institutions. So you're supposed to be exposing and providing APIs that can achieve certain things. And if you describe a workflow for that, then that allows the powers that be to actually ensure and check that the providers are doing what they say on the tin. I think the last very interesting use case right now is around the AI potential. So we see a lot of work happening, especially with OpenAI and the fact that they have the plugin manifests, and there you can populate it with an open API definition. And I think if you were to enhance that by also providing a workflows definition, that really describes to these models as to how you can achieve an outcome. And it can hopefully get to the point where we're not delivering APIs purely with prompting as being the primary use case, and we can deliver APIs being more value orientated, and then have another mechanism that sits on top that describes how to extract that value from one or more APIs.
So that's a lot to unpack. You listed a very long sequence, I think, of potential use cases there for the workflow specification. I think they're all super interesting. The one thing that stuck out to me, just because I see that so much, was this idea that yes, in today's API documentation, you often see workflows, but they're just represented in a human readable way, which is good as far as it goes, but that lacks the ability to get updated, to be supported by tooling, and then all these kind of things. So, and I think the same is kind of true for all the other scenarios you were saying, where in all those scenarios, we do see that people are doing it, but it's just not as convenient or as effective as it could be if we had something that was a little bit more machine oriented. Now, very briefly, because to be honest, I don't have such a long background in that specific space, but I do know that there are other specifications out there, such as BPMN and BPEL, and some other existing notations and languages that focus on processes or whatever you call those things. Could you briefly tell us how the OAI workflows specifications contrasts itself to those approaches?
Yeah, so we did, I guess you call it our due diligence on the other specifications that are out there. So we looked at different CDL capabilities, BPMN, of course, some BPEL options as well. Um, the expectation was that they're very good, they're very broad, they cover all aspects of kind of process description and to a very kind of granular level. We wanted something that was very much focused on the API space, working very well with other common specifications that are out there, like OpenAPI and into the future async API as well. And we were very mindful that we didn't want to go down all of the rabbit holes that presented themselves. So we were quite restrained with regards to, okay, let's tackle the primary use cases that we see, and let's have a simple to implement specification that will have a good opportunity to be, let's say, leveraged by tooling vendors and sufficiently low barrier of entry with regards to the practitioners and the people who will be crafting documents conforming to this specification. We also looked at an interesting one in the CNCF Foundation called serverless workflows. And we did discuss also with that working group around should we join forces, but we believe that there's sufficient differentiation in the goals of what we're trying to achieve. So for now, we're keeping close connections with that group, but we still see the merits in having the individual specifications because they attack different problem spaces.
Okay, and now let's just have a brief look at how it looks in practice. And because everything that has something to do with OpenAPI, of course, needs to address the pet store. You have you have an example around this, and what I like about this example is that it does use this scenario where you have actually more than one API that you're trying to build a workflow over or against, whatever you call that. Could you briefly tell us the scenario that you're using there so that we can understand what's going on?
Yeah, sure. So in this hypothetical example, the workflow that we want to be able to achieve is to adopt a pet matching certain criteria. And to facilitate that behind the scenes, we have two different APIs. We have a pets API, which interacts with the pets resources, and then we have an adoptions API, which does everything that you need to do with regards to adoption resources. But of course, there's some connection with regards to the schemas that are used there and so forth. So the steps for the workflow would be, the first step is we of course have to search for a pet to find the pet that we would like to adopt. Once we do that, then we want to initiate an adoption request. We want to then confirm that the adoption is actually now being executed. So there we would have to execute a patch request, for example, on that adoption to update the status. And then finally, we want to come back and verify that if we look at that pets resource again through the pets API, that it has itself been updated to state that it's adopted. And what the What the workflow specification would look like is a YAML structure where we would have some metadata, of course, describing what this workflow does. We then have the concept of source documents. So these would be the reference documents to the Pets API and the adoptions API. Potentially, we could reference other workflows there too if we had broken things up into different workflows. Then we have the workflows themselves, and that's just inputs that are needed to kick off the workflow, and then a collection of steps that need to be executed. So the steps that I just went through, each of those steps can spit out outputs that are relevant within the context of the workflow. And then at the end, the workflow itself can spit out outputs that's relevant to either the end consumer or the client that's consuming the workflow. So it would look like this YAML that we see here. Nothing too complex. And the benefit is that YAML then can be leveraged by tooling to spit out a more human-friendly representation of that workflow. And again, this is all around getting to the point where you understand the business value of these APIs as quickly as possible, and you're not necessarily being blinded by the complexity or the volume of all of the information that's in the core documents themselves. But I'm focusing here on, okay, I want to search and adopt a pet. What do I need to know in order to achieve this specific use case?
And I think what's really cool about this example also is that it perfectly adapts to this scenario where you have potentially multiple pet stores and multiple adoption agencies, right? You can mix and match things. So it's not just that it gives you this process that goes across APIs, it also almost implicitly or by definition then, right, allows you to also use that in examples where you have more than one provider for those APIs. And I think that's something where we will probably see a lot of very interesting potential scenarios and use cases for this specification. Now, the graphic that you've shown is something that you've hand created, as I understand it, but that's exactly where I think we will see a lot of value being created with once everything is stable. We will see software coming out that actually supports this kind of representation. So could you briefly talk to us about the timeline for the specification and when to expect those first tools maybe becoming available?
As long as you don't hold me to it, but we are making very good progress over the last couple of months. Granted, we're in the middle of summer now, so things quieten down a little bit, but our working expectation is that we want to have an implementer draft out towards the end of this quarter. So towards the end of September, we want to have what we will kind of stamp as an implementer draft from an Open API initiative perspective. And that's kind of giving a little bit more confidence to tooling vendors like ourselves, like other friends that we have in the space, that, okay, now we can start building on top of this because it's stable enough, and we can start making tooling that will allow the broader community to start interacting and leveraging the value that we see the potential for the workflow specification bringing to the practitioners.
Yeah, I think it'll be really interesting to see all the different areas where we will see some tooling emerging, right? I see definitely documentation tooling has a good, I think, use case for that. As you said, like testing, verification tooling. What other kind of tools would you say maybe would pick that up relatively quickly?
Yeah, I think I mentioned it, but I'm quite interested to see what some of the AI companies will do with it. I think it opens a very interesting door there. So, of course, they're doing stuff directly with Open API definitions, and then I think people are jumping on top, kind of maybe tweaking how the Open API description will work so that it can support prompting a little bit better. But this will give a more meaningful way to say, okay, this is the achievable workflow. So now you will just wrap kind of a natural language abstraction on top of that to really improve the human's ability to achieve that workflow. And then behind the scenes, those API calls are very assertable, very understandable. You're not dealing with any real ambiguity. As long as the source documents are well described, then the workflow can be very well described on top, and there's no kind of mismatch in assumptions, which I think is incredibly powerful.
And we'll get interoperability, right? Right now, you could say, well, if OpenAI does something really cool in their plugin system, that's fine. But if I then start designing for this plugin system, that only works with OpenAI. And I think that's the power of standards. If we have something that is generally accepted, then I can use my workflows description to go into any kind of tooling that supports it. And I think that's always where we then see this nice network effect, I would say, where things
Correct.
suddenly start gaining more momentum because they are so widely adopted. Frank, thank you so much for taking the time. I think this is really exciting work. So we'll see you at a conference not too far from now at API Days London, giving a presentation about this. I'll link this presentation from here once it is available. This is in September 2023 for those watching in the future. But so there will be more information out there. For now, I think it's mostly a little bit of a kind of look into the future, but I think it's really interesting work, and I'm guessing we'll see a lot of that. I'm really excited to see this getting to the point where people will start implementing and using it.
Me too.
Okay, thanks so much for joining us, Frank, and thanks everybody for watching. If you like this, please give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing, and until next time, keep getting APIs to work. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.